Good morning. Believe it or not, it is morning here. There's just a real bad thunderstorm going on outside, so it's pretty dark in here. Yeah, so it recently came to my attention that the CDC has put out a new report on the birth rate in the United States, and it has declined. It's apparently at its lowest point since 1970. So I'm going to go ahead and read a little bit from this NPR article that I thought summarized the problem pretty well. It says the birth rate fell for nearly every group of women of reproductive age in the United States in 2017, reflecting a sharp drop that saw the fewest newborns since 1987, according to a new report by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. There were 3,853,472 births in the U.S. in 2017, down 2% from 2016 and the lowest number in 30 years. The general fertility rate sank to a record low of 60.2 births per 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 44, a 3% drop from 2016, the CDC said in its tally of provisional data for the year. The results put the U.S. further away from a viable replacement rate, the standard for a generation being able to replicate its numbers. The rate has generally been below replacement since 1971, according to a report from the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics. The CDC calculates a quote-unquote total fertility rate by estimating how many babies a hypothetical group of 1,000 women would be likely to have over their lifetime. That measure now stands at 1,764.5 births per 1,000 women, a 3% drop from 2016. The replacement rate is 2,100 births per 1,000 women. So as you can see, the United States hovers at something like a 1.7 birth rate, which is below replacement. Obviously, a woman has to have at least 2 children to maintain replacement rate in a population. So this sets up a lot of interesting problems. The most obvious problem is that the way that we fund our social safety nets for the elderly, namely Social Security, is well, it used to be a system wherein you paid in and you drew money out. Now it essentially functions as a Ponzi scheme where you rob Peter to pay Paul. In this instance, you rob the, well, not rob, you tax the younger generation to pay for the Social Security that the older generation use. And, you know, I don't want to degrade the system or anything like that, or degrade people who live on the system. That's just how it works. And so in order to be sustainable, you have to have a certain number of young workers in the economy who are not drawing Social Security to make the system work. What it has also created is a very interesting cultural moment, because there is something fundamentally and deep-seatedly wrong in the human subconscious, or I'm sorry, there are alarm bells that go off in the human subconscious when they hear these sorts of things, like the birth rates falling in a lot of people, right? It's just sort of a primordial like thing, you know, it just goes off. And so in order to combat that natalist tendency, there is sort of a cultural force that bites back against that undercurrent. And what that usually takes the form of is articles in the national newspapers talking about the child-free life, how it is a perfectly rational, natural decision to not have children, and how it should be acceptable, and how people who have children, in a sense, oppress or discriminate against people who don't have children, find them unnecessarily selfish or what have you. Now, first off, as someone who is a traditionalist, who is very much in favor of people having children, I want to caution other people like me from simply saying, well, people need to have more children, they're selfish, blah, 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 because that doesn't actually get at the root of the problem. We're in a cultural moment where child rearing is not seen as sacrosanct as it used to be. So I have some notes written down, and I'm just going to go through them and hopefully sort of collect my thoughts as I'm going. So the first point I want to make is that there is this cultural sort of this zeitgeist going on right now that says that choosing not to have kids is natural. Kids are smelly, they're weird, they cost a lot of money, they prevent you from going out and doing the sorts of things that you want to do. So it's just better to not have kids. And I can understand this impulse, and rationally it makes a lot of sense because yes, kids do cost money, and they do take away time from other things. But it's a weird contention to say that not wanting to have kids is a natural impulse. And I know the reason why they want to say it's a natural impulse, because we have we have in our society this idea that if something is natural, that it's in some sense good. But we do lots of things that are unnatural that we consider to be good, or at least not bad. But not having children is one of those things that can never be considered natural for two reasons. And there are two ways to look at it, right? You can look at it from an evolutionary perspective, from a materialist perspective, or from a Christian perspective, or a spiritual perspective. So from an evolutionary perspective, if you choose to not have children, you are creating an evolutionary dead end, which is odd. Organisms usually don't, of course, no other organisms have volition. So we're unique in that regard. But it's very rarely seen in natural, non-lab settings for an organism to just say, you know what, I'm just done existing. I want to cause my species to go extinct. And so they just don't have children. So from an evolutionary perspective, it doesn't make any sense because you're dead-ending yourself or your genes. You're not passing on your genes. And I don't have to tell people that that's how evolution works, is you maintain the fitness of your offspring. Or, well, you maintain offspring who, as far as I can tell, the human race is highly evolutionarily fit. So the fact that they would not have offspring is odd. Another thing is, if you look at it from the Christian perspective, it's obviously an unnatural thing because it's been part of Christian doctrine for so long. Be fruitful and multiply, that children are blessings, they bring good things. So it's weird, right? But like I said, it doesn't have to be natural, right, to be something that is necessarily good. Because wearing clothes is unnatural, but yet we would never say, or sorry, the majority of people would never say that walking around in public without clothes on is a good idea. So whether something is natural or unnatural or not is sort of irrelevant. But if you want to say that not having children is natural or a natural impulse, then you're wrong. And if you don't want to have children for the fact that you feel like the earth is overpopulated or whatever, if you live in a first world country, that's not an issue. First world countries are not overpopulated. If you look at places like the United States, they are mostly empty space. The U.S. is mostly empty space. Places like Britain and France that are more developed are a little bit more dense. But for the most part, Western countries are not overpopulated. So you having one or two kids is not going to hurt anything. And right, that's another thing. It's, you're not going to flood the world with people if you have two children. That's just making sure that when you die, there's going to be, people that replace you and whoever you had your child with. So this leads to another interesting problem, which is that falling birth rates um, will end up with you having a lack of funding for your social safety net, your specifically in the United States Social Security program. And what that leads people to do is, instead of saying we need to have more children or we need to restructure our entitlement programs, what they say instead is that we need to import people from other countries to work and pay taxes to support our elderly. And while that would be all well and good, the problem is that when you do that, you have people who, by and large, do have children, which is poorer people, um, who resent the fact that they are being, I mean, they're being replaced for economic reasons, or replaced, we'll say augmented. They're being augmented by people from other countries for economic reasons. And it sends a message to those people that the economic value of a citizen, uh, trumps their allegiance to the country, or however long they've been in the country, whether they have roots there or not. Their economic output and their ability to give back to the welfare state is a measure of their worth to the people who govern the society, right? And so that necessarily leads to the kind of populism that we've seen with Donald Trump, which makes the people who wanted to import the migrants in the first place very uneasy, because they can't deal with all the xenophobia of the working class, which they've invited in themselves. So their solution has problems, and rather than deal with those problems or find a new solution, they want to harass the working classes because they're horribly, horribly racist. And this leads us to another problem, is that something that feminists will bemoan is that there is no paid family leave in the United States. At least it's not government mandated. There are companies that provide it, but it's not mandated by the government. And I will grant them this position, that it's not mandated by the government, and it would be a boon to reproduction probably if it were. The problem being, first, we don't have the money to pay for it. And this is a problem that afflicts all new government policies that specifically those on the left want to implement. And those on the right are not exempt from this problem, but people on the left who want to create new programs or subsidize existing programs that are not working as well, the problem is we actually don't have the money. So right now the government borrows a certain portion of its budget, which means it does not take in enough money in taxes to actually pay for the entitlements and things that we have right now, right at this moment. And so the idea that we would be able to pay for these types of programs is laughable. We would just put ourselves into more debt, and it's not clear that the amount of money that the government would have to foot for this, or the amount of money they would lose in tax revenue from businesses not being able to provide paid family leave, would actually make up, it's not clear that the child that would occur in that instance would make up the financial difference, if we just want to look at people as, financial or purely economical animals. And it may not solve the problem, because if you loop back to point one, there is a culture in this country of not wanting to have children, of regarding childbearing and having children as the end of your life, a terrible thing that should not have to be endured. All right. Well, so we've discussed sort of the issues surrounding the thing. And I want to talk about reasons why a return to traditional ways of organizing the family and traditional ways of looking at childcare would be good in this situation. So first thing I want to say is we're not going to get back to a time where most women stay at home, because a lot of women like working. They like their careers, and that's fine. I don't think they should give up their careers to raise children if they don't want to. But we should also understand that lots of women, even those in high power careers, would rather raise children. And we know that women who stay at home and raise children are happiest. We also know that women who, children who are raised by stay-at-home mothers have the best outcomes as far as, whether both parents works, one parent works, whatever. We know that if at least one parent stays home, and it's usually the mother, if at least one parent stays home, then that leads to better outcomes for the children, right? If traditional values were more widely practiced, there would be fewer out-of-wedlock births, which right now is a serious problem in the country, is that even though we have a low birth rate, a lot of the births that we already have are out of wedlock, which means that these mothers require lots of government assistance usually. So if we had fewer out-of-wedlock births, there would be less need for government assistance for those unmarried mothers. And, well, first off, it would also lead to better outcomes for children, because we know that children raised without a father or with a boyfriend cohabiting or what have you have poorer outcomes than those who are raised by their two biological parents in a stable marriage. But what it'll also do is it'll free up public funds to pay for these neonatalist policies that feminists have said will increase our birth rate, which I think in some instances are necessary, just given the restraints of the modern economic system and the way it functions. Another thing is that conservatives have more children generally. So if society was more conservative, I'm sure you can hear the thunder. The storm is not cooperating with me today. But anyway, so if there were more conservatives and conservatives had more children, this would mean more money for comfortable freeloading from sort of your East Coast liberal types who don't want to have children. I don't mean freeloading. I don't mean that to be a negative term, even though it's sort of a loaded term. I just mean that if they don't want to have children, the sheer overflowing of children from traditional arrangements will make up for the money that would be lost from them not having children, as far as paying for their entitlements are concerned. I think this is actually the key issue and the most important thing about the childless versus neonatalist debate, is that I think children bring a spiritual vibrance to a place. For example, I go to two churches. I go to a church in my parish at home. I go to my parish church at home, and then when I'm at college, I go to the parish church that is for the college, or the area around the college. And at the college church, there are young people, and I don't just mean just college age kids. I mean genuinely young people, 4 or 5 year old children, and there are quite a few of them. And it brings a sense of fullness and continuity to the place to have people from 70 on down to 7. It gives you a much fuller range of human experience. It gives you a much fuller range of human interaction, and it gives you a sense that the place is alive and has a continuity about it. Whereas if you go to my parish church at home, it's an older parish and there are fewer children that go there. There are no children under, I think, 10 years old. And while it's a nice church, it's not as vibrant or full as the church that I go to at college. And I think a lot of that has to do with the lack of small children there. And I think this applies not only to churches, but to the country as a whole. And even now, when we have young children, I've noticed that parents tend to sequester their children a lot more nowadays. They don't let them play out in the street as much, and they don't take them out shopping and things as much because they can just sit them at home on the couch with the iPad, and they're all good. And so there's a sense of vibrance that's lost in the public square when we don't have lots of young children running around. And I think it lightens people's mood. And I think if more people had contact with younger children, then they would feel less. They would feel less Malthusian. Maybe they would feel more of a personal impetus to have children of their own. I know, for example, I didn't particularly like children until I was around a few of them, and then that's what really made me, like children and want to have some at some point. And another thing that I want to talk about before I go is how we can reclaim the family structure. So since the 50s, I suppose, there's been this idea in the United States of the nuclear family, which is the mother, father, and their children that live in one house. And I think we need to wholly discard this model of family entirely, because I think it is overly atomistic and alienizing. What we need to do is we need to have more multi-generational families. So we need to have grandparents living in when they get too old to live on their own, for example, or just grandparents that come in and help, after they've retired. And this would make up for a lot of the babysitting and childcare issues. If you have more older family members who can take care of children. I know that my family was particularly blessed to have grandparents who were around who could lend a hand. And if we encouraged more of that sort of thing, more multi-generational family structures, then that would definitely help. I also think it would increase the dignity of people at later stages of their life, where they're supremely helpful, invaluable to the family, and also that because they're living in with the family, they don't have to be, say, sent to a nursing home or something like that, which I find nursing homes very distasteful institutions. And I know that they serve a valuable function, but the elderly are much better cared for by people who love them, which is their family. And that in and of itself is going to be a more complicated issue, because it's going to require cheaper housing, right? And it's going to require things like the ability to add on apartments much easier to existing properties. So there's a lot of land reform that could go along with that to make multi-generational families more sustainable. But also, I think there needs to be a cultural push back towards having multi-generational families. And not only that, but also having older siblings help out with the younger children. I know that in and of itself can be extremely helpful. Well, I've been talking for 20 minutes now. So I've covered the issue of declining births in the United States, how the issue is sort of self-reinforcing, how it's both economic and cultural in its nature, and how traditions and return to a traditional model of the family and traditional living can help alleviate this problem. So, this has been the Hidebound Convivium. Thank you for watching.